All right, thanks everyone for joining on this beautiful Friday. Looking out my window, seems like it's pretty nice. I am in my basement, and that is my first floor up there. Tonight we're going to hear from Pete on Next.js, which is something he's been wanting to talk about for years. But first, I'm going to send this to Zach to tell us about Scale FLX and what they're trying to do for the Finger Lakes region.
Thanks, George. Thanks for inviting me to this. I'm excited to be a part of Rock Dev and to see what I learn from it over the next years. Um, so, Scale FLX is a nonprofit organization. Well, we're pending. We're not officially nonprofit yet, but we don't make any profit. And our
Hey Zach,
goal.
can you move the mic closer to your mouth?
Oh, sorry. Can
There
you
you
hear me
go.
better now?
Yes,
Yeah.
much. Thank you.
Okay, so if you couldn't hear me, Scale FLX is a nonprofit or a pending nonprofit that we just started earlier this year with the goal of creating a stronger software ecosystem in Rochester for developers to be employed. So what this means is our goal over the next 10, 20 years or sooner, if we can make it happen, is to gain 25,000 net new jobs in Rochester and in the Finger Lakes region in general, as we start to build stronger relationships in Boston or in Buffalo, Syracuse, et cetera. The way that we're doing that is talking to high growth startups and established Fortune 1000 software companies that are in the more expensive tech cities like San Francisco, Boston, New York City, and then working with them to open satellite offices here. And so we started right before COVID. And we had our first company come visit. And then after that, of course, we can't even get on an airplane. So it's been difficult to move that, but it helped us look at some of the other pieces of closing this gap between bringing in companies and having talent, accessible and ready to take those jobs. So one of the other sides of the company that we want to, or of our organization that we want to do, is make sure that we're educating and getting certifications to people who've taken non-traditional tracks in their careers. So somebody who could be AWS qualified or get some cloud certifications, we want to start putting together some educational opportunities to connect them with those training courses for free. So we're kind of on both sides where we want to try to attract companies and then also make sure that as we attract companies, we have the talent ready to go work for them. And so really what that means for everybody in this meeting and hopefully in RockDev as I build up more relationships is, we want to help you get better local jobs. So better local jobs with name brand software companies that'll build your career, and then with exciting projects at growing startups where you can build that kind of a career, kind of like whatever you want to do. I guess that's the general idea of it, and we're at the early stages, but we've been building some strong relationships at all the way up city and county and a little bit at the state level to help, and then with those different companies. Does that make sense? I don't know. That was a really off the cuff pitch.
Ah, that makes sense. Trying to bring in more things for us people to do. I like it.
Yeah, one thing that would be helpful though, if anybody wants to email me, my phone, I'll put my email in the chat, and then also you can just sign up on the website, just to contact us at scaleflx.com. And my email is zach@scaleflx.com. Is the more people who anonymously kind of want to, like, more or less, I need to build a process for a passive talent pool where people would stay anonymous, but we know what the types of talent we have in Rochester, so that then I can tell you, hey, there's this cloud job that's showing up, or this cybersecurity job, or this company needs 5 of these. Like, I need to be able to reach out to people who are qualified in that in Rochester, and then they can decide if they want to be introduced to the company. But otherwise, I'm talking to companies, and they're like, okay, well, where is the talent then? Yeah. Any questions? No.
No, that's awesome.
Cool.
There's definitely a lot of people that I always know are looking. So if you ever do find anything, pass it along.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be absolutely pushing like as soon as I get the next company that's like, yeah, sure, find me 5 developers, I'll be right on RockDev, right? Like where else am I going to go right now? We're not really a recruiting company. We're not a for-profit company, so we're not going to build that out in the same way. So it's really just
Sure.
getting connected to all these different pieces of the community so that when we attract a company to Rochester for 2 days, they can meet people who, are actually interested to work with them.
Right. And you're not a traditional recruiter getting 20% of my first year's salary for placing me.
Right, we're going to get 0% of your salary ever. So we just want Rochester to be a stronger ecosystem. It helps everybody. And as this organization grows, hopefully we're able to have interns and people rotate through it to help. But then, like, I gain from it too. I go start a company and the ecosystem stronger means that I have better talent to work with because they're not going to San Francisco for their first job because we have cool companies here.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pete, Next.js.
All right, Next.js. Let's see. I'm going to try sharing my screen here. I want to move this chat window out of the way. So bear with me for a moment. Share.
I have granted you the ability to share your screen.
Okay, and you should see my screen shared. Do you see a slide deck by any chance?
Affirmative.
Okay, cool. So Next.js. This is, as George mentioned, this was something I was planning on presenting, I don't know, 2 years ago, maybe more. And in some ways, it's kind of good that I waited because, like anything, this product has evolved over time. And so we're going to actually be able to cover some relatively new features that really kind of extend the reach of what this could do. So it's kind of, even if we had covered it before, probably been a good idea for me to cover it a second time. So essentially what this is and what this kind of started out to be is a way to do server-side rendering for React applications, right? So if you're familiar with a typical React application, you have a web page. Web page serves up some HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript. And then nothing really renders in the user's browser until the JavaScript executes, right? And so there can be some performance-related issues with that. Especially if the person is on like a bandwidth constrained network, like on a mobile device or something like that. So if you can pre-render at least a portion of the page on the server side, it has the potential to load a lot more quickly. And there's a difference between sort of statically rendering a page and server-side rendering a page. And we're going to kind of cover what some of those differences are. But typical static rendering of a page is just a bunch of pre-built HTML files. So when someone comes and visits that page, the web server is going to serve that page up very quickly. It doesn't require a lot of server-side resources, and the user gets a response of some sort in their browser much faster. If we do a server-side rendered page, now we're doing some processing on the server side. Maybe we're doing some database lookups. Maybe we're going to, collect some data and put it on a web page before we send it down to the user. There still is some performance benefits potentially to that, in that the user doesn't have to wait for all the JavaScript to load in their browser before it goes and makes a network request and starts to pull in more information. So one of the other benefits is improved search engine optimization. So for many years, Google wouldn't execute JavaScript on a web page at all. So if your content was generated on the page through JavaScript, Google didn't see it. So they didn't index it. Some time ago, Google added the ability to execute some amount of JavaScript on a page. It's still somewhat of a bit of a mystery as to how much JavaScript can actually be executed and what Google really sees when that JavaScript executes. But there are, Google's not the only crawler that's out there. There are other crawlers as well, some of which may not render JavaScript. So there's definitely generally an improvement in search engine hits and traffic if you can do some server-side rendering. So that's another very important use case for this. You can progressively render content. So we're actually going to see when we go through my little example here, we're going to see a page that is partially server-side rendered and partially client-side rendered. So using Next, we have the ability to do some static rendering, some server-side rendering, and then some client-side rendering. So that gives you a lot more power to kind of move the workload wherever you need it to be, depending upon the specific use case that you have for that page too. So part of your application could be statically rendered, part of it could be server-side rendered, and part of it could be client-side rendered. The other thing is sensitive content could be potentially rendered server-side. And what I mean by that is when we're rendering code in the browser, we're pushing JavaScript down. And that allows us to, inspect and potentially debug, look at network traffic that goes on between the client and the server. If I can move some of that traffic up onto the server so that the client side never sees any of that, I have potential to obscure or hide some of that traffic from the end user, which could improve in maybe not so much security, but perhaps some intellectual property discovery as well. So that's another benefit to server-side rendering. So why Next.js? Essentially, it affords us 3 capabilities that we didn't really have, which is plain React out of the box. One would be the static generation of pages, and this is actually a relatively new feature of Next.js. The original Next.js really just did server-side rendering of pages. So you could do server-side rendering, and you could, of course, because you're doing React, you could do some client-side code too, and that was it. And you had to use something like Gatsby.js if you wanted to do a true static generation of a site. So there's a bunch of, Jekyll, there's a bunch of static site generators out there. Well, now Next.js is a static site generator as well. So when we work on our project here, I can actually tell it to export a directory structure, and we'll take a look at what that directory structure is like. When we do that export, it will actually build a bunch of content for us, and then we can simply upload that content to just a plain vanilla HTTP server and serve out the content. So if we wanted to build like a blog post system, or we have been discussing about a potential like a newsletter for RockDev, we could do that using this static generation. The server-side rendering of pages is, again, that's going to be rendered on demand, so it's not pre-built. That means that I am going to need a server-side environment to execute, right? And this is code that's written in JavaScript, so it's executing in Node. So we're going to have some kind of execution environment. And we're going to see that there's a bunch of different ways to do that. I mean, the classic example is to spin up a Node server somewhere in the cloud and let that process all these inbound requests. Of course, with the advent of things like serverless, AWS Lambda, stuff like that, Netlify, there's actually ways now to operate Next.js in that type of an environment as well. So it's just executing the functions on demand, sort of functions as a service. And so we have the support for that. And then lastly, API support. I mentioned that we have the ability to build some client-side logic, right, to have the application, some of the JavaScript run on the client side. Typically that client side code is going to make some calls back to the server, and the server is maybe going to fetch some data, send it back in a JSON payload typically, or maybe GraphQL. So the API support is important, and you will see that Next.js can support as a sort of host your API as well. And I'll give a little example of an API supported in that way. So some of the key features here, and we can go to the Next.js page. I'll show you that on their site as well, some of their key features. But it's the server-side rendering, the static site generation. There's out-of-the-box support for a lot of things that you typically have to set up if you're building a regular React app out of the box. CSS modules, Sass, less, etc., hot module reloading, all of this kind of stuff. You typically have to either use something like Create React App to set this all up, or go through a rather tedious process of getting this all installed and up and running. It turns out with Next.js, you basically just install Next.js, and then you're going to get all of this functionality. When you build a React app, you're familiar with something like React Router, but we typically need some mechanism to route the user between pages in an application. We're going to see that Next.js actually comes with its own routing system, and it's just a sort of a file-based or directory-based system that lets us navigate from page to page. And we have an API that we can call, and we also have a component that we can use in our React pages to support that. There's hot module reloading for development. So for those people that aren't familiar with that, that's a Webpack feature. that allows you to maybe change your CSS on the fly, and when you save the file, you'll see that change immediately rendered in the browser. Now that happens when you're running in a development mode. When we actually go ahead and produce the output for deployment, that hot module reloading code is taken away. But for development, it's really nice. You can make changes to your components, both code and presentation, like CSS, and you can see that reflected without having to continually refresh the browser. There's production build optimization. So when we actually are ready to sort of deploy our solution, there's a build step that we go through. Next.js actually goes through your application. It can build the static resources. It also sets up functions that will handle all the server-side rendering. It will also build bundles for each page, so it can do incremental loading of your application. So if I've got maybe 20 web pages in my application, I have a product list page, a product detail page, a shopping cart page, maybe some kind of an order review page. Each one of those is in a Next.js application at a high level is a separate React component. But there's no need to load all of those components at runtime if the user is simply on the home page, right? Or maybe on the product list page. There's no reason to load the shopping cart yet until the user goes to that page. So we'll see that the production build optimization manages that for us as well. And it does some rather clever incremental loading and prefetching of components as well. So depending, as we scroll through a web page, we're actually going to see it dynamically load components that the user might click on. So it'll actually have some of that hot loaded for us and ready to go as soon as the user clicks on the link. Again, just to provide a more responsive experience for the user. It's used by a lot of different companies. These are just a few that I kind of scraped off the Next.js site. I wanted to point out Measures for Justice, which is a local firm here in Rochester. I happen to know they use this in their infrastructure. I was hoping Josh was going to be here to talk about this maybe a little bit more as well. But that's at least one local organization that I know that uses this. But you can see there's quite a few really well-known names out there that are using this as well. I mentioned before static versus server-side rendering, and we're going to get to some code here pretty soon and a demo. As I mentioned, every page that you build is a React component, and the Next framework has to know how to render a given page. And it does that by looking at your page and determining whether or not you have these methods implemented. And there's two important methods here. One is called get static props, and the other one is called get server-side props. So if Next.js sees that you have a get static props function defined on your component, it knows that this is a page that can be totally statically rendered. So maybe we're a company and we have 24 products that we are going to put up on our site. So that's not going to be terribly difficult to pre-render 24 pages. So we might, on our product detail page, we might choose to have a get static props method that will go ahead and fetch the content for the 25 products and then pre-render those pages. So that will work out pretty nicely. However, maybe we're somebody like Wegmans and we have, maybe 200,000 SKUs. I'm not exactly sure how many SKUs Wegmans has, but I'm sure it's well over 100,000 that they stock in various stores. To pre-render the content for all of those SKUs would probably be pretty overwhelming. So for that, we might choose to say, hey, rather than statically render that, we're going to dynamically render some of those pages because we don't want to incur that build time cost, and maybe the frequency of customers that land on any given SKU is far lower, so it's not necessary to have them pre-rendered. So for there, we could use the get server-side props function, and if that one is defined, then Next knows that, hey, when the person comes and visits this page, I need to go out and fetch the data at runtime and then present that information. The other thing that's important to note is that the get static props, right, we're statically generating the content. So the content that we're going to display to that user is only as fresh as the last build time, right? So the last time it went through and generated this. So if you have data that changes hourly, get static props is probably not a great choice, right? Whereas get server-side props would be a lot more useful for that. There used to be a method in Next.js, it's still supported, but it's kind of deprecated, called get initial props. And this kind of harks back to the older days of Next.js when it really just did server-side rendering and didn't support the static operation. So now to kind of delineate between the static operation and the server-side operation, they kind of said, all right, well, let's get rid of this get initial props thing and let's use the server-side props instead. So before we go on to this, I think I'm going to show a demo here of an application so you can get a little better understanding of how this thing works. Now, what I've done on this particular example, I took a blog post demo app that that you actually you go through when you're learning how to use Next. There's a little tutorial that you can take, and you build this little blog thing. And what they basically do is have you create a bunch of markdown files in a directory, and then Next.js will actually go out there and index all the blog articles that are there. It'll build a little page here with some links that you can click on, and then you can go ahead and look at the content for that particular blog post. Not all that exciting really, but the interesting thing is to see how this actually works and renders in the user's browser. Additionally, I did a little bit more work with this, and I decided to extend this a bit further to say, hey, let me do some real-time lookup of some data. And let me do some of that work client side and also server side. So you can kind of see three modes of operation here. We have this content, which is statically rendered, right? So this blog post never changes. So we can go ahead and statically generate that. And even if we generated it 2 weeks ago, this blog post is still legit. It doesn't really need to change. However, the weather report does change. And so I probably don't want that thing statically generated. So if I go ahead and click on this link, we'll see it takes just a moment and it'll give me the current temperature and humidity. I'm using openweathermap.org. They have a kind of a public API. They have a free tier that you can do queries. You can pass it a zip code and it'll go ahead and look up the weather for that zip code. So what I did is I defined a server-side prop here, our get server-side prop, that basically said, hey, go call that weather API, get the current weather forecast for my zip code, and then render that onto the page and then send that back to the user. So I will step through the network. The reason this is open here, the network console is open, is to kind of show you a little bit how this rendering actually works. And what data we're fetching and what's coming down to the browser and what's not. Also, though, I can go ahead and type in like a zip code here and hit enter, and we'll see a forecast comes back for that particular zip code. So in that case, I'm actually doing this in React on the client side. So this table was generated client side, but I made a server-side request to an API endpoint. So that gives you kind of an example of different ways in which you can do this. You can see here, here's my little request that I sent out for that particular city of Levittown. And here's a list of the 3-hour forecasts and the current temperature and icon, etc. All right, so let me go back to the home and show you, we're gonna dock this thing to the bottom because there's some clever stuff that it does in incrementally loading. Well, I guess first thing I wanted to do is render this page. And I wanted to show you what comes back from the server. So normally, if this was a regular React app, we wouldn't get any content back. We wouldn't see the blog entries here. This is actually in HTML. It came back from the server, but it's actually a React component that generated this. So this particular page is also statically rendered. So at build time, Next created this page. It stored away the HTML for it, so it's ready to go. And when I click on this, it can serve this content up very, very quickly. When I click on one of these links, I'm just going to go ahead and clear the network trace here. I'm going to go ahead and click this link, and I want you to see what came back. I got some JSON back, but I didn't get HTML. I got page props. So this is actually data that's being passed into my React component. All right, so it's very efficient in what got sent down. I didn't get bound a whole page. I got just the JSON that represents that particular page. All right, and so if I go back now a screen and click on this one, right, now I'll get the pre-rendering JSON, which is the next article, right? So it loads very, very quickly because it only has to pull down that little bit. Now, something that's kind of interesting here is if I take this and I dock this to the bottom, and the reason I'm doing this is I want to constrain the viewport here. So I'm going to make the viewport very small so you can't see all of the content here. And then I'm just going to reload the page. And you can see that my main page loaded here, right? I've still got my content. I've loaded a couple of JS files, and that's about it. But as I go onto this page, I want you to look at this network trace down here. In fact, we'll clear the panel so we don't see anything in there. As I scroll down, you're going to see it just loaded some additional content. As I get near the links on the page that would link to those features, it will incrementally load the JavaScript that's necessary to support that link. So if the user gets near the link for example, the weather component, right, to look at the current weather, it's going to actually load the JS file for that. We can see that here. If we scroll down a little bit further, we're going to see ssg.ssr.json. So the JSON that was necessary to render the article about server-side rendering, that one has come down to the client now as well. And it's in the client-side cache, so I can go out and when I click on that, it'll be in my cache and I can render this really quickly. Likewise, if you look at this escaped out file, it's really id.js. This is the JavaScript file that will render a blog post article. So it's not only incrementally loading the data necessary to support that link, but it's also loading the component and components, the bundle that's necessary to render that particular page. So it's pretty cool the way this works. And there's not a lot of work that you have to do as a developer to get this to work. You just use this special link component and point it to the directory path where this file is going to be served from, and it goes ahead and takes care of the rest of this. So the other thing that's kind of interesting is I've shown you what happens when we, let's bring this down a little bit. When we come in here and we visit a page, for example, like this page here, right, we saw that we got the content for our main page. And then when we clicked onto a blog post page, we got JSON that represented that blog post page, right? That's down here. We didn't get any more components because the component that's necessary to generate this page is reflected in this JavaScript file. Well, what would happen if I was a crawler or maybe an end user that sends a link to their buddy that says, hey, I want you to read this post specifically on server-side rendering, right? To wait for all of this JavaScript and CSS and stuff to load, again, wouldn't provide a very rapid experience for the user. So let's go ahead and reload this and see what we get now instead. If I scroll up to the top and I go to ssg.ssr, now the response from the server is a pre-rendered page with all of this blog post content. I didn't have to go through and load all of that other stuff in order to see the content, right? Everything else that's coming in here afterwards is just supporting JavaScript files and content that will enable me to navigate elsewhere on the site later on, but I'm able to provide content to the user much, much faster this way. Right, and you can see like there's an index.js file that's been loaded. That's the file that takes me back to the home here. So when I go to hit home, now, interestingly enough, if I scroll here, I get a, I get the index.json, which the page props are gonna have the list of all the posts on it. Right, so now I didn't have to go and hit the server and pull down all the HTML for the home page because I already have a component that does this. So Next is kind of seamlessly sometimes sending the client server-side HTML, and sometimes it's sending it JavaScript It's doing whatever the most efficient mechanism is, dependent upon where the users, how the user's visiting the site, which is, really a pretty slick feature. And when we go through the code, you'll see there's really not much that you have to do as a developer to manage this. It's all managed within Next. So let's go actually and look at some of this code a little bit to kind of show how this is tied together. So I'm going to make let me know when this size, is this size large enough that you can see my code? Does this work for you guys? Yes? No?
Maybe a touch
little
bigger.
more? A little more? How about that? That should probably work.
Good for me.
All right, cool. All right, so what I want to do is give you a little tour of this application and kind of what's in here. And as I said, I based this off the tutorial and then just added some additional stuff to it. And I can share the Git repo with you guys later, and you can pull this down and play with it if you want as well. In every Next.js project, there is sort of a standard directory structure. Most of the stuff that's in here is not stuff that you actually have to create. The most important thing here is this pages directory. All of your content is served out of this pages directory. And it starts out with the index.js file. And this index.js file represents our home page, our kind of starting page. I have another page that I've defined called weather.js, which kind of corresponds to the weather forecast. So if I were to go in here and click on the weather request here, you'll see that it's my site / weather, right? And so that's how I'm visiting that. If I go back here and I click on a blog post, you'll see I'm visiting posts and then the post ID, right? In this case, it's ssg.ssr. Otherwise, maybe it's this pre-rendering one. Okay, so how are those served up? Again, it's going to go into the posts folder. It's going to look for the particular item that we're looking for. Now, these are referred to as dynamic routes, and we're going to kind of cover what a dynamic route is. But essentially, we're going to plug an ID into this sort of placeholder here. That's why the ID is in the square braces. And we're going to fetch the content based on that. I also have another page in here that was just called first post. So if I go into this one, he's just a regularly statically generated page. Go ahead and click on that. If it says posts first post, it'll go ahead and show that particular page. All right, so let's go back to the index and take a really quick look at this. The important part of this page is down here. You'll see that we're exporting a function called getStaticProps. So that's a flag to Next.js that, hey, this is going to be a statically rendered page. So at build time, I'm going to go and collect the data. I'm going to populate this .next directory with information about the content that's supposed to be rendered on that page. And then when I export my site, it's actually going to export it out into this out directory, which is the output. And if I have just a static web server, I can just run it within this out directory and serve up my site. So otherwise, but essentially what's going to happen here is when getStaticProps runs, it goes ahead on the server side, or in this case, during the build process, it's acting as sort of a Node.js application. And it's going to go ahead and run this getSortedPostData. This is just the name of a function that was written here in this lib folder. You can call it this thing anything you want. It doesn't have to be in a folder called lib. This was just what the Next.js guys happen to use for their particular application. So inside here, we've got a couple of different functions. GetSortedPostData is just going to go out and use the path library that's part of Node, right, to go and get the current working directory, look in the posts subdirectory. So that's right over here where we have our two markdown files, right? If we look at them, they're just ordinary markdown files here. And oops, get sorted posts. Oops, where did I go here? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and read that directory. We're going to walk the file names and do some simple cleanup on this. Like to get the ID, we're going to strip the .md file off the name. That's going to be our slug, like our ID value. We're going to go ahead and read the markdown file as a string because we need to out of those markdown files, we're going to need to go and get some of this metadata, right? Because in a markdown file here, we have a title and date. So we're going to need out of each one of these files the title and date, because that's what we're going to populate onto our page, right? Because we have our title here and our date and our ID, which is based on the file name. So we're going to go ahead and read file sync, right? To just suck the contents of that file in. We're going to use this library called Matter, which actually knows how to parse one of these markdown files and pull out the metadata from the file as well. Excuse me for a minute. And then we're going to combine that data with the ID, and we're going to return that back, right? So the result of this is going to be an all posts data file with an array of IDs and the data that we collected from this Matter result, all right? And we're going to take that data and we're going to feed that back into our parent function here, which is the actual React component. And you can see it wants a prop passed to it, a prop just like you would make any other React component. The prop is going to be all post data. So it's going to have that array in it. And then just like anything else you do in React, right, you can see that we're going to actually iterate over that all post data. We're going to have a call a map function on that thing, and we're going to walk through the posts. We're going to pull out the ID, the date, and the title. And then we're just going to build some LI tags, pretty simple stuff. We're going to use this rather interesting component here that comes with Next.js. And that's the thing that lets us go ahead and build these dynamic routes. So we're going to give it an href. This is basically telling Next.js what template we're going to use to build these guys. And then we're going to tell it, we're going to then use the as to actually build the links, right? So this is going to just fill in the ID. So we're going to build a bunch of entries in here with this href and the as. And that's all we need to do in order to get Next.js to build these links that are in here. It automatically does all of that scrolling behavior that I had shown you before. That capability is already built in there. The router knows when you're going to click on a given page, hey, is that a server-side rendered page or is that a statically rendered page, right? It's going to manage all of that for you as well. You don't have to worry about, oh, I got to go into a different directory to process a statically rendered thing versus a dynamically server-side rendered thing. You don't have to deal with any of that. The router and this link component deals with all of that stuff for you. All right, and then we just put the date on here. So that's pretty straightforward to do that. Now, the next thing we've got to do is generate the actual posts themselves, right? So we've gone ahead and seen how we generated this page. Now we want to say, okay, how do we actually generate these? And how do we get this guy to go out and stamp out a page for each one of the blog posts that we have? So if we go and look inside here, inside the actual posts directory, we'll see that we have two functions here. We have get static paths and get static props. Get static paths is used to go out and define all of the paths that are going to ever link to this particular page. So what we're basically going to do is call a method here, get all post IDs, right? Which is going to, again, just like we read the directory before to get that list of posts, we're going to do the same thing, except now we're just going to get that array of file names. We're going to strip the .md extension off the end of them and just return them as a bunch of IDs, right? So that's pretty easy. And so now I have a list of paths, which are all of these IDs. And notice that in each one of these, the param is called ID. That ID has to match the ID that's in this name here, in our file name, that placeholder. So if you had multiple placeholders in our file name, we would want to make sure that the array of parameters that we returned had a value for each of those keys. All right, so that's all we have to do to do that. And then what happens is Next.js says, okay, great. Now I know that there's, say, 24 blog posts that I have to generate, and these are the URLs for all of them. Now I'm going to go ahead and invoke the get static props method 25 times or 24 times if there's 24 of them. We're going to go ahead and call that 24 times, and each time we're going to pass it parameters, and those parameters are going to contain the ID. So we're going to invoke this function a number of times to get the static props for each of these posts, and then it's going to use that to actually render out the pages. Okay, so here's again what the type of data that we're getting back in our post data. We had a title, we have some headings and so forth, like for classes. We have a date here. In React, you use dangerously set inner HTML if you want to actually inject HTML content into a React component. Again, this is actually being executed server side, but this is how you would do this in React. All right, so any questions so far on what I've covered? Okay, cool. So what I'm going to move to next then is kind of covering a server-side rendered page. So we've done the statically rendered stuff. Now let's see what a server-side rendered page looks like. And for that, they didn't really have an example of that. So that's where I came up with this little weather report page instead, right? And so if I scroll to the bottom of this, you'll see that we have a get server-side props function that we're defining. So that flags to Next that, hey, when I go ahead and render these, I'm going to do this as a server-side rendered thing, not statically rendered. So it's not going to do it at build time. It's going to do it at runtime when the user requests this page. So I just wrote this really simple get weather by zip function here, which calls open weather map, reaches out, passes, looks into my environment, and they have a way in Next.js to support environment variables. It's going to go ahead and get my app ID, and then just call the URL I just used a version of Node fetch here. So I get the fetch API in Node, turn that stuff into JSON, and then return the JSON back, right? So it's pretty simple what's going on here to go ahead and fetch the weather for a given zip code. Okay, and then I'm going to return that as a prop called rock weather. And when I get up here, you'll see my weather component expects a rock weather prop, right? And so now this is actually data that's going to be coming back from that API. In fact, I think I can show, this is an example of what the response looks like. This is what would come back from the server, right? You get the name, the coordinates, sunrise and sunset, and then, I'm sorry, this is the forecast. The one that we're talking about right now is just the current weather. All right, so this is giving me the current conditions, an icon that I can display, the min and max temperature, stuff like that, right? So I'm just pulling values out of this, return result and rendering this stuff onto the screen. It's pretty simple. Now what's going on here though is only a portion of this is server-side rendered and a portion of it is client-side rendered, right? When I go ahead and I use this particular page here, let's go back to the weather, right? I get some of this content that is server-side rendered, and that is the current temperature and humidity in Rochester. But I can type in a zip code and hit enter. And when I do that, I get a forecast for another location. That is being done client-side. So I have a client-side component here and I have a server-side component. And that's kind of what I wanted to show next, that you can kind of mix and match this technique. So you don't have to render all of your content server-side if you don't want to. So in this case, I just have a forecast input component, which is nothing more than just a little input box here. There's a form here with an input on it. When we change the zip code, we're just going to hold that in a little state variable here. And when the person does the form submit, which in my case is just hitting the enter key on the form, it's going to go ahead and call onZipSubmit, which is a function that was passed into the forecast input. So that's the onZip change here. So when the zip code changes, we're going to go ahead and we're going to call our API, and we're going to ask for the weather forecast by zip code. And then we're going to go ahead and await for the JSON response to come back, and then set the forecast with the fetched forecast, right? So whatever came back from the server, there's going to be some JSON payload there. We're going to set that. Because this is a React hook, because we set the forecast, that's going to cause this page to reload again. And if I scroll down here, you'll see I have a little conditional test that's being done here to say, hey, if the forecast variable is defined, then we'll be. So that's what's kind of going on here. And you can see I'm walking through the forecast list entries and rendering out that information. So let's go back to the forecast so you can see what that looks like. This is what comes back from the API. So again, the city that you're currently looking at, and then an array. It's every 3 hours what the current climate is, and what the current temperature is, and the forecast is for that time. So, and this is kind of what it looks like when it's displayed. Right, so that's pretty straightforward as well. Inside here, I don't think I'm doing anything too crazy. Open Weather Map hosts these image icons. So they give you the code for each icon, and that's all I'm doing is just rendering that stuff out onto the page here. But that gives you an example as I can go in here now, and again, with my network panel open, I can go ahead and hit enter and fetch something else, and you see all I'm doing is making a regular, AJAX call to pull down this data. Nothing crazy going on here. This is just like any other React app would be, except that the API is being hosted for me within Next, so I don't actually have to spin up any additional servers. And it knows to do this because inside my pages directory, I defined an API directory. And inside there, I can have this thing nested out many levels as well. And I can create patterns in here, like I have a weather by zip. And of course, I'm passing in the zip code as the parameter. And you can kind of see what this function looks like. All it does is just like you have in a Node application, you get a request and a response, right? So in my request, I'm pulling out of my request. I'm looking in the query property inside the request to get the zip code field out of that. And if I don't have a zip code, I'll throw back an HTTP 400 and tell you that the zip code is required. Otherwise, I'll call that same get weather by zip API that we saw before, and we'll just set the status to 200 and shoot back the JSON that has the weather forecast in it, right? So that's the current weather, and the weather by forecast is the same thing. I did add a little bit of code in here because the response that comes back from Open Weather Map is pretty verbose, and I didn't need all of that content. So I decided that I do a little processing up front here and streamline this a little bit so I wouldn't send so much stuff down to the client. But effectively, it works the same way. So that is the difference between server-side rendered and statically rendered, and also the ability for you, of course, to do client-side rendering too. All right, any questions so far? Okay, cool. Let's see.
I got one for you, Pete.
Okay.
How does it handle? Get my video. How does Next.js set like the content expiration for caching?
Yeah, there's ways to do that. I don't recall off the top of my head. I'd have to go look that up for you, George. I don't remember. Right. But there are ways to reflect the headers and so forth. And you also have the ability, I'm going to show you in a little bit here, a lot of customizations that you can do as well to adjust the way the page renders, what goes in the header section, stuff like that. You do have a lot of control over that kind of stuff.
Gotcha, cool.
Okay, but you do have the ability, though, when you're in the API one, you do have the ability to set all of the response headers. So you could do the caching there. Like if that's what your question is, like how are you doing response caching for the API, you do have the ability to send back any headers in here that you want. But I believe there's a way to do it on the server side rendered stuff as well. Okay, let's see. We're going to go back to, whoops, go back to my presentation if I can find it. Yeah. All right. So we talked about the get static props and the server-side props. I mentioned that the data is the entire page is rendered server-side when you request a page directly. We saw that. And if you link to that page and the user clicks on the link via the link component or by using Next.js's router, then it will sort of intelligently render that data through another component and then just dynamically fetch the JSON down to that has that particular data in it. So that works out rather nicely. And as I mentioned, get initial props is kind of a deprecated thing at this point. Routing, we kind of covered a lot of this already. That file system-based router that's based on pages. The link component that supports linking to pages via client-side page transitions. As I mentioned and demonstrated earlier, it prefetches those statically rendered page JSON files for links. So as you're scrolling through the viewport, it thinks, hey, the user might try to visit this thing. So let's go ahead and fetch the data and the component necessary to render that just in the event that they actually happen to click on that thing, which I thought that was a pretty cool piece of functionality. There's also a router that's here that I don't have a demo for you on that has a complete API. Lets you basically push and pop things off to like the history stack. You can go ahead and go back. You can jump to a particular page. You can replace the history, stuff like that. Pretty normal stuff that you'd have in a router. That would be for scenarios maybe where you programmatically want to take the user to another page, not on the basis simply of them clicking on a link somewhere. So you do have both capabilities for navigation. I mentioned the API routes. Everything that's in pages/API is mapped into that API folder. Here's an example from the docs, again, that I kind of showed you a better one than this really. But the ability to set those headers and then just send back a response with some JSON, etc. So it's really pretty straightforward. If you've done any Node or Express work, and the middleware for Express works with this as well. So if you've got Express-based middleware, you could use that with this. The next part here is on deployment. So Next is made by a company called Vercel, and Vercel makes its money largely, I believe, by selling hosting plans. So what we're running on right now here, this Next.js site that I'm on, this used to be called Now.js. There was a company called Zeit, and Zeit became Vercel. And now the Now.js thing is just now called Vercel. So they kind of changed the names around, but I think it's the same people, just maybe some new venture capital money, I'm not sure. But essentially, that's the hosting platform for this. Now, I'm going to show you other ways in which you can host this stuff, because you certainly don't have to use their platform. They do make it really easy. You basically take your code, push it into a Git repo, go to Vercel, tell Vercel where your Git repo is. And I'm going to go in, see if I can find this is my little kind of dashboard here for my account. So inside here, I can go ahead and define, where my site is, where, what I want to have deployed. It'll show every time that I've made some changes into the master branch on that Git repo. It'll go ahead and regenerate this thing and tell me what the state of it is. I think in the settings thing, it actually specifies the Git integration. So this is where my stuff is on GitHub. I can define some custom domains. Of course, I don't have anything like that defined here. I have the ability to tweak the build command that runs, the root directory, specify environment variables. So as I mentioned, the open weather map API, I don't want to publicly store that key in my Git repo. So if you go into my Git repo, you won't see the key in there either. At runtime, the open weather API key is fed in because I set it inside Vercel. when you're running that thing locally, you can go ahead in the root directory here, you can set an env.local, and there's my key. All right, so that's how you run it locally. And then you just put in your git ignore file to tell it, hey, I don't ever want to put any of these env local files up into Git. So there's no possibility that those keys leaking somewhere into Git. All right, so so that's how that's handled. So any of your like database connection strings, stuff like that, you'd probably do through environment variables like that. All right, so deploying this was really easy. Like I said, all I had to do was put this directory structure into Git, point Vercel at it, and then they went ahead and ran the build process and stood up the site for me, and it was a piece of cake to get up and running. Now, you know, some people won't necessarily want to host their stuff with Vercel, so you can host it several different ways. As I mentioned, you know, there's some basic commands that you can run here, like if I do npm run build, right, this will actually go ahead and create an optimized build for me. So in effect, this is what Vercel is doing when you go ahead and put, you know, make any kinds of change to your Git repo. It pulls the code down and then runs the build command on it. And you can see it even has gone through my different pages and identified what pages are statically rendered and what pages are dynamically rendered. So there's a little key here. Let me make this window a little bigger so we can see this better. Okay, there's a little key here that says anything with the little lambda symbol in front of it is effect like a serverless thing, like a lambda function. That means that it is server-side rendered. So there's a hello path, which we didn't see. It just says hello world. The API weather by zip, the weather by forecast, the weather thing itself, those are all server-side rendered pages. So there's the little lambda symbol in front of them. Pages that are static, they have no initial props in them. They don't have a get initial props, get server-side props, or get static props. Then it will say, all right, that's just a static page. I'll go ahead and create that page for you. So my 404 page is like that, and my first post page is like that as well. It has nothing. Let's go ahead and look at first post. Right, there's nothing inside here that needs any data. First post doesn't receive any props or anything like that, so we can just go ahead and serve this thing up directly, and that's what that's showing me. And it's showing me the size of each one of those, etc. Once I've got this generated, I could do one of two things. Now, for this particular application, because we have some pages here that are Lambda related, it wouldn't really be appropriate for me to try to export and run this whole thing as a static site, because some of the stuff isn't going to work properly, because I need server-side generation. We can try running this anyway. Okay, so we got an error, and that's because we ran into some pages that need that have server-side props on them, right? So we're not able to actually generate this. But if I wanted to host this in sort of in a production run, I could just do npm start, and now I'm go ahead and I'm running this from localhost, right? And I can just go ahead and run this thing. And so if I had, you know, this running on any provider that could host a node process, I would be able to run this thing. It would be pretty straightforward to do that. Now, there is also a way to deploy this to some other common hosting platforms, Netlify being one of them, and then also AWS Lambda. And it turns out that there's a lot of activity in this area recently. I mean, I started to work on this presentation earlier in May, and actually even in early parts of June, I was finding new blog posts being written where people are continuing to work on features for Next. So where do my slides go? Okay, so we'll go back here. There is a way to do hosting on Netlify as well as Azure static websites. So I've linked here to a blog post that will show you how to basically put your same content into a Git repo and then have Netlify pull from the Git repo, and then in effect run the Next.js build process and the Next.js export process, and then it's hosting everything on Netlify. And Netlify has a really generous free tier. The performance is really good. So if you're going to do something with just a statically generated site, that's probably the way to go. Microsoft I think it was just at the Build conference that was run a few weeks ago, they officially launched something called Azure Static Websites. It's the same idea that you can go ahead and have a React application that uses some Azure Cloud functions. There's a blog post that shows you a tutorial that shows you how to use Next.js in that environment as well. So I actually went through that one. It worked out pretty well as well. But both of those examples are just doing static rendering. So if that's all you needed for your project, that would work great. You could use those two approaches. However, what if you're in a situation where you want to do some server-side rendering? Things get a little bit more complicated then, because now we have to have some code that runs on the server side that's going to do some of that dynamic page generation. And Next on Netlify is one of the ones that I found, and this one's pretty slick. It goes ahead and takes each of your server-side rendered pages and turns each one of them into a Netlify cloud function. So if you've worked on a Netlify project before, you probably know that there's a functions directory, and inside that functions directory you can put all of your server-side functions, which are really nothing more than AWS Lambda functions, because Netlify really runs on AWS. So they manage all of the Lambda deployment stuff for you. But that's in effect what this thing does. So it's pretty slick. I haven't actually tried it myself, but I read through a couple blog posts on how to use this thing, and it looks pretty straightforward. So it's something I'll play with a little bit more, and maybe I can report back on that in the future. Also, hosting on AWS Lambda, I found another article on how to do that. And that works out really well too. It supports both the static rendering as well as the server-side rendering, and it uses Lambda at Edge to do that. So all of the server-side rendering is being done in Lambda functions, but there are Lambda functions that are running in CloudFront, and CloudFront is the CDN service that AWS has. So that's another approach that looked pretty slick. And this ability to support the statically rendered pages is relatively new, because Next just released this a few months ago. And so people are kind of catching up now and figuring out ways to integrate that static functionality on popular platforms like Lambda and Netlify. So I'll certainly share out this slide deck, and it'll have all these links in it. So if you want to investigate some of these additional deployment methods, you can. Vercel does have a free tier, so maybe for what your needs are, the Vercel free tier is adequate. You just have to kind of look at that and see what works for you. They claim that they've done a bunch more optimization. You'll get the highest performance by using their stuff. Admittedly, on my really simple examples that I've tried so far, I didn't see a huge difference, but you might see that on a real production app. And there are some advanced features here as well. I'm just going to go ahead and click on some of this just to kind of show you. There's like a preview mode here. This is used for those statically rendered pages. What if I'm working on a headless content management system where I'm writing new content and I want to preview it on the site? I haven't published it yet, so that blog post is not maybe in a Git repo, so the site hasn't rebuilt yet. So how am I going to go ahead and preview that to see what the thing might look like once it's published? They have a whole mechanism here on how to support that. They have support in here for AMP. So I think maybe you guys remember, it was a while ago, I did a presentation on accelerated mobile pages, right? This is a Google thing designed to get pages to render really quickly on mobile devices. So they walk through the whole thing on here on how to use AMP components. They all start with an AMP dash in front of them. So that capability is there. The ability to customize the Babel config, support all kinds of stuff in post CSS. I'm using CSS modules in this particular example, along with Sass. So they support styled components, stuff like that too. If you're into that for React. It's an example of a custom server. If you want to run your own custom Express server, you don't want to run theirs, you can do that. There is the notion of a custom app. So your components are rendered within the app. If you want to influence how that app works, maybe inject some special styles in there or do special transitions as the user moves from page to page in the site, you might want to leverage this app component. So you can kind of tweak that stuff. You can tweak the document as well, because as I mentioned, we're not actually writing an HTML document anywhere. We're not writing a body tag or anything like that. So this gives you the ability to customize that stuff if you needed to. Things like that. So it's you also have the ability to specify, custom error pages and a 404 page and all that kind of stuff too. So all in all, it's been pretty easy to work with, and I like the fact that it supports that server-side and statically rendered content, but I also like it just for doing React development. It's kind of a nice alternative to create React app because it takes care of a lot of the pain of setting up a React project, especially if you want to use some of the more advanced features like styled components or CSS modules, stuff like that. They have all that kind of pre-baked for you, and it works out really nicely. So I think that's about all I had. Yep, that's all I had for tonight. You can find me on RockDev as ptreg. I'll work with George to get the slides out, to get a link to the Git repo that had that little example app in it. And then George has recorded this session, so we're going to be making this available on YouTube as well. Maybe we'll just drop the links to some of this other stuff in the YouTube description for that video. But that's all I got. If you guys have any questions, feel free.
Thank you, Peter. May I ask that would you share the slides with us as well? Because some of the links are very helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yep. I'll work with George. We'll try to get that all bundled together. So you're going to, you have the video and you have links to the slides, and then I'll link to the Git repo with that little sample application in it.
Cool. Thank you for your generosity.
Sure.
Nice. For my question earlier on caching,
yes.
It looks like Next.js in their source code, I posted a link to it in Zoom chat here. They're using e-tags, which makes sense. Right. And in development, they override the cache control header to force revalidation and no caching. So.
Okay. There you go.
Any other questions from the audience? Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, Pete.
Well, sure
and Zach
thing.
for earlier.
Yeah. Absolutely.